Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. And I'm your host, Henry Smith. Welcome to the program. Today we're going to be talking about the early chapters of the book of Genesis. And in particular, ABR has held in the history of its ministry that Genesis 1 through 11 presents to us actual, factual, historical events of how God created the world, how God created man, the fall of man, and the flood in particular. This history of the Bible is in direct conflict with the prevailing macroevolutionary presentation of cosmic history that's found in the secular scientific community and held by most people in our culture. Now, one of the questions that people ask about this is, aren't you just reading your Bible and not being scientific? Well, we're going to deal with just one aspect of that today with very important evidence with Dr. Brian Thomas of the Institute for Creation Research, who's going to help navigate us through one of these scientific questions. So Brian, welcome to Digging for Truth, my friend. Good to have you back on the show.
Hello, Henry. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
All right, my friend. Well, it's good to see you. You've been on the show before. We encourage folks to go through our YouTube channel and look for episodes with you. We talked about dinosaurs in the past. We're going to touch on a little bit today. But our subject today, Dr. Thomas, is something that's very important. Probably something some people have heard of, what we call carbon-14 or radiocarbon dating. Now, most people don't know how that works, but you're an expert on the subject. And so I would love to start the show by you explaining what it is and the basic principles of how it works. And then we're going to show how it actually is our friend for those of us who hold the view of the Bible that we agree to.
Right. Yeah, great setup. Thank you. So radiocarbon dating starts with, we first have to understand just a little bit of science, and then we'll move from there. I'll try to keep it pretty basic, but in general, we have a carbon-14, which is a version of a carbon atom, and it's a particular version that is radioactive, and it's got the nucleus. The atom has a mass of 14, which is too heavy, and so it's unstable. The vast majority of carbon atoms are stable, mass of 12. And so what this unstable carbon-14 atom does is it emits radiation, electrons mostly. And as it emits this radiation, it restabilizes. And in fact, it turns into nitrogen. So, so we have carbon-14 atoms that decay into nitrogen at a stable, measurable pace. Now, this is intriguing for those who wish to use it as a clock, because it's a clock-like decay process. But when we measure radiocarbon, we're looking at the ratio of carbon-14, that's the unstable, to carbon-12, which is the stable isotope among other isotopes. So we're looking at the ratio. Now, a ratio, is that the same thing as a time on a calendar? No, it's not. So you have to convert the ratio into time if you're going to try to use it to date an object, and that formula that we use to convert the ratios into a time estimate. That formula includes assumptions. It has variables that we don't know the answer to. So we don't know the original starting conditions. We don't know how much radiocarbon to stable carbon. We don't know the ratio of that original of that original carbon-based sample. So that's some of the basics. So if our assumption about the starting conditions is correct, then you might be getting a carbon age for a sample that is really close to the calendar or actual age. But if those starting assumptions start to diverge from reality, then we're getting carbon years assigned to an artifact. And those carbon years may diverge considerably from the actual calendar years. And it turns out, I think, that the most recent, say within the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, carbon-based, like trees or bones, or not as much bones, more like tooth enamel is a more popular a material to analyze. Coal, you can analyze charcoal remains, and to look for the radiocarbon ratios. And I think for artifacts within the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, it does align pretty well with other sources of dating, like pottery, as you guys know.
Yes.
So anyway, but once you get into the old stuff, we have real divergence, I think. So that's sort of the basics.
Excellent.
Did you ask 2 questions in there?
No, you did great. Now, a couple of follow-up things I want to get for someone unfamiliar. We are not talking about the millions or billions of years that different dating methods give. We're not talking about rocks. We are talking about things that were once alive that are now dead, right? So expand on that a little, and also what the outer limits of the possible dates that you can get from this methodology.
Right. So the outer limits would be theoretical, and you're right. We don't use radiocarbon as one of the isotope systems for direct, quote unquote, dating of igneous rocks. So we use other isotope systems for that. And the reason is because radiocarbon has a relatively short half-life, which is a way to express its decay rate. So the half-life of radiocarbon is 5,730 years, which just means that after that amount of time, half of the original radiocarbon that was in the sample when that plant or animal died has, on average, decayed back into nitrogen. And then 2 of those half-lives, 2 times 5,730 years, you'd have half again would have decayed away. And so that's that describes a decay curve, so that after, say, 60 to 100, well, in theory, 100,000 carbon years maximum, you'll have no more detectable radiocarbon left in any sample. And that's what made it intriguing to a prior generation of ICR scientists who decided, well, wait a minute, our model of the flood, Noah's flood being real, as you said in the introduction, actual factual history. I like the way you said that. If the flood is actual and factual, then that flood would explain all these rock layers, including the organic components, the organic fossils that they contain. And so we thought, well, if the max shelf life, if you will, for radiocarbon is 100,000 years in theory, and if we find radiocarbon in a sample from a geologic setting, for example, which has a secular age assignment well in excess of 100,000 years, they put assignments, in the order of millions, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of years to some of these carbon-containing Earth materials.
All right. Well,
and so we used that as a test.
That's great. That's a great summary. We're going to explore how you guys did that in our next segment, and we'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Brian Thomas, research scientist with the Institute for Creation Research. And we're talking about radiocarbon dating and how it actually helps us to vindicate the timeline of the Bible and the early chapters of Genesis. Okay, Brian, so you laid out the basic argument is if you have things from the past that the scientists claim are millions or billions of years old, and you find radiocarbon in them scientifically, then that obviously is a contradiction or a conflict in interpreting the evidence. and you guys did a project beginning back in 2007 regarding this very thing. Tell us about that. It's really fascinating.
Sure. So, well, we did a project at the Institute called the RATE project. RATE stands for Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth. It had many angles and aspects. Most of the project was concerned with other isotope systems that are used to date igneous rocks. But one of the aspects that we tested had to do with the radiocarbon isotope system, and it began from the observation of okay, so there's a machine, a device that we use to do radiocarbon dating, and it's called an accelerator mass spectrometer. So, and it counts the number of different flavors of atoms, C14, C13, C12. And what you have to do to get this thing running is to use an instrument blank. It's like a blank. So you, instead of before you put your sample in, which is the unknown, you're supposed to put a blank in, which has a known quantity of the element that you're trying to measure. In this case, carbon 14. And it turns out that every blank they put in, like if they're using coal, let's say Pennsylvanian coal, which has an evolutionary age assignment of 200 plus million years, well, they kept finding more radiocarbon in their sample blanks than they expected. And so the instrument should get us down to high resolution, which would then in theory take you further back in time if your carbon years are, we're pretending like those carbon years equal calendar years, making assumptions. Anyway, that was the gist. Well, the bottom line is we said, well, if you're having a hard time finding instrument blanks in materials that are from that old, then maybe the materials aren't that old. And if the coal or natural gas or whatever you're using, graphite, marble, I mean, they kept scouring Earth materials to find something that had no radiocarbon left in it. And after 100,000 years, it should have had no radiocarbon left in it. And so the industry is having a hard time. So we thought, let's use this as a test. We got our own coal samples carefully extracted, and then we sent them to a radiocarbon dating facility just to carbon date the coals. And of course, we returned to all 10 samples had a radiocarbon in these coals. Now the coals are supposed to be millions of years old, but the radiocarbon content in those coals suggested that the coals were thousands, not millions of years old. And that was the first result. And really, it's a fulfilled prediction of the flood model. The flood says, our flood model says the flood of Noah's day deposited all these rock layers, including the coal layers that are sandwiched between some of these sedimentary rock layers. And so that would have happened, 4,400 years ago? Thousands, not millions. So we'd expect maybe to find some radiocarbon still in those coals, and we found it. And so that was our prediction. We published in, I think, 2003, and then we published the results in 2006 from that project. That was step one.
Very good. Yeah, so the logic of that, I think you've laid it out very well, is quite simple. The coal is supposed to be 200 million years old. At 100,000 years, the date, you can't find any more carbon-14. It's not measurable. You can't detect it anymore with your testing equipment. And yet, now, would you say that it was a significant amount of carbon-14? I mean, maybe that's not technical enough of a question, but like, is it not just traces, but like a significant amount? Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, significant versus traces. So it's statistically significant from the standpoint of certain labs have done the work of measuring how much radiocarbon is bouncing around in the laboratory atmosphere, the air in the sample chamber, places like that. And so that's you can estimate, you can measure some of that. And so our coal samples had, consistent with the many other coal samples that secularists had been trying to use as sample blanks, ours also had radiocarbon levels. They're not very high levels, but they had still radiocarbon levels, say an order of magnitude above what we'd expect just from laboratory background levels.
Okay, so the what's around in the air, as it were, if you want to say it in layman's terms, is accounted for in the way that this is calculated. So this is done very precisely. So obviously they're aware of that when you send it to the lab. Now these are independent laboratories. These are not creationist laboratories, right? I mean, you're sending this off because, you know, as usual, we'll be accused of biasing the data or that kind of thing. You're sending this off to professional radiocarbon measurement facilities. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And we had to use a third party to maintain anonymity, and so the bias wouldn't play as big a role. So that as far as the lab technicians knew, they were just doing a routine analysis from a secular colleague.
Yeah, that's very good. Okay, so in our next segment, Dr. Thomas, we're going to talk about a woman's favorite subject, not chocolate, but diamonds, and also everybody's favorite subject, and that is dinosaurs. And friends, stick around for this break, and we'll be right back.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Brian Thomas from ICR. We're talking about radiocarbon dating and how it actually supports the biblical model of world history. Okay, Brian, you were explaining some of the aspects of it related to coal. We have amounts of carbon-14 found in coal. It shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be measurable, but it is, and so it's a contradiction. But then we mentioned diamonds. Diamonds are a girl's best friend, but they're also a creationist friend. So tell us about why that's the case.
Well, I'll tell you, and this is another fantastic result from the RATE project that we did. But I want to offer a quick clarification. It's not that we're trying to date these coals or to assign a carbon age. We're not doing radiocarbon dating necessarily in the usual way, because we don't care. We recognize that you can't get an accurate date or age just from carbon-14 ratios. When it comes to artifacts that are this old, we don't know the starting conditions. Therefore we can't. We would need a time machine to go back to the flood.
Good. That's
and
good.
measure the atmospheric levels of radiocarbon. We can't do that.
Right.
And so, but what we can do is use radiocarbon as a test between these two extremely different ways of thinking about rock layers. One way is millions of years. The other way is the Bible's thousands of years. And so that's what we did. And so, so the brilliant RATE researchers who were with the Institute for Creation Research back when we were in California, now we're in Dallas, they thought, hey, if there's radiocarbon in measurable amounts above sample blanks and above instrumentation background levels, then that means it's intrinsic to the coal. So the radiocarbon must be coming from the coal. There's no other reasonable source for that modern-looking, recent-looking, still throwing off radiation radiocarbon. And so they thought, what about diamonds? And so they collected 10 diamonds, tested those, and lo and behold, a little less radiocarbon in those than in the coals, but still measurable levels of radiocarbon in those diamonds. Now, diamonds have an age assignment of 3 billion years, billion with a B like banana. But we would say the whole Earth was created just thousands of years ago, and that's consistent. It's more consistent for sure with the result that we got from the rate team.
So that's even more incongruent than the conventional dating of coal. You shouldn't find any carbon-14 because the date, it should all be gone. And now in diamonds, we have it 10 times as old as the coal, as it were. And you found it in there too. So you know, as you're thinking about that, you go, wait a minute, these are sort of like centerpieces of what we hear about the age of the world when we're growing up in the public school system, we hear on TV, it's everywhere, it's in the air. You know, and yet your results are pointing to something quite different.
Quite different, and but you know, that's what the Bible presents. It presents a view of the world that is quite different from the mainstream view of the world, and so it really confronts us, each individual, with: am I going to trust what God says about the past, or am I going to go with what's popular and cool? Well, here at the Institute, we're more inclined to go with what God says, because it's, you know, Genesis is eyewitness accounting of what went on. And so so what we're seeing now is evidence from the sciences that supports and sort of aligns with that biblical view of history. And that leads me to my area, where I was able to radiocarbon analyze, I'll say, a series of fossils. So if we have radiocarbon in coal, if we have it in diamonds, and then we have these deeply buried fossil bones, maybe there's radiocarbon in those. And sure enough, we've got several dozen samples of radiocarbon in fossil bones, and many of them in dinosaur bones that we've collected and curated here at the Institute in Dallas. And so we published those results in 2015, and we're trying to, we have some new results. We're going to try to publish those in a secular setting, but having a hard time doing so, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I would imagine. I think the genie's out of the bottle. I think you guys opened up something here that can be explored ad infinitum, because there's stuff being discovered that can be tested, you know, in excavations around the world, dinosaurs and so on. So, okay, so spell this out then for us, Dr. Thomas. Again, like the diamonds, we have a juxtaposition. Tell the audience the conventional view on the age of the dinosaurs versus the fact you found the carbon-14 there, and what logical conclusion does that lead to?
Yeah, thank you. So dinosaur samples that we have are generally Cretaceous, Upper Cretaceous, which we call middle of the flood year. And so the secular age assignment is something on the order of 70 million years, but we would just call it in the middle of the flood year. That 1 year deposited thousands of feet of geologic strata in our model, which is Bible-centric. And if that's the case, then yeah, the coals were deposited right before some months before the dinosaurs, you know, in a lot of places. And then a lot of more coals were deposited after the dinosaurs in layers above those. And so we have radiocarbon results from the coals, the fossils, coals above it, and all of these results keep coming in with radiocarbon, way more than expected. And so what we're doing, the job of a good scientist in this, to try to answer this question, is we're looking for sources of contamination, because what we want to do is try to prove the opposing perspective. And so far we're coming up with blank stares as far as where can we find a source of radiocarbon other than the original biomaterial itself, that's the carbon that's in the diamond, the carbon that's in the coal or that's in the bone. And so far that's the best, most reasonable source of the radiocarbon that we keep finding.
Excellent.
Which means, as you asked, that it looks thousands not millions of years old, from the perspective of the amount of radiocarbon that we're finding in these.
Yes.
And that gives us more confidence that Genesis really got something right.
Yep. God is the eyewitness. Well, Dr. Thomas, thank you for all your hard work. Thanks for coming on the show again. We're going to have you on again to talk some more about another topic, and so we hope folks will tune in. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you very much.
Friends, thank you for watching Digging for Truth. We hope that you think about this paradigm-altering evidence that Dr. Thomas has presented, that you can trust the scriptures, the early chapters of Genesis, as real history. Thank you for supporting us and joining us today.